D99 by H.B. Fyfe, Chapter 4. This LibriVox recording is in public domain. Westervelt sat at his little desk in the corner, doodling out possible ways and means of breaking out of his cell 30 fathoms or so underwater. From time to time, Beryl or Simonetta offered a suggestion. He knew that everyone in the office was probably engaged in the same puzzle. Smith believed in general brainstorming and getting a project started, since no one could tell where a good idea might not originate. "If I ever get into space," Willie muttered, "it will never be to a planet as wet as Trident. Whatever made this Harris think he was a pearl diver?" "Is that what he was after?" asked Beryl. "No, I just made that up." He glanced over at Simonetta, who winked and continued with a letter she was transcribing. An earphone reproduced Smith's dictation from his tape. As she listened, she edited mentally and spoke into the microphone of her typing machine, which transcribed her words as type. Westervelt realized that it was more difficult than it seemed to do the job so smoothly. He had noticed Beryl rewriting letters 2 or 3 times, and Parrish was more likely than the boss to set down his thoughts in a logical order. "I've heard so many wild ideas in this office," said Beryl, "that I simply don't know where to start. How do they decide on a good way?" "They guess, just the way we've been doing. They're better guessers than we are, from experience." "It's just a matter of judgment, I suppose," Beryl admitted. "They make their share of mistakes," Simonetta put in. "Yeah, I read an old report on a great one," said Westervelt. "Ever hear of the time they were shipping oxygen tanks to 3 spacers jailed out around Mazar?" Simonetta stopped talking her letter, and the girls gave Willie their attention. "It seems," he continued, "that an exploring ship landed on a planet of that star and found a kind of civilization they hadn't bargained for. The natives breathe the air with a high chlorine content, so when they grabbed 3 of the crew for hostages, the ship had to keep supplying fresh tanks of oxygen." "How long could they keep that up?" asked Beryl. "Not indefinitely, anyway. They weren't recovering any carbon dioxide for processing, the way they would in the ship. The captain figured he'd better lift in orbit while he tried to negotiate. Meanwhile, he sent to the department for help, and they came up with a poor guess." "What?" "They got the captain to disguise some spacesuit rockets as oxygen tanks and send them down by the auxiliary rocket they were using to make deliveries and keep contact. The idea was that the prisoners would fly themselves over the walls like angels, the rocket would snatch them up, and they'd all filter the green-white light of Mazar from their lenses forever." "And why didn't it work?" "Oh, it worked," said Westervelt. "It worked beautifully. The only trouble was that when they got these 3 guys aboard and were picking up stellar speed, they found that the Mazarians had pulled a sleight of hand. They'd stuck 3 of their own into the Terran spacesuits, pretty cramped but able to move, and sent them to spy out the ship. Well, the captain took one look and realized it was all over. He couldn't supply the Mazarians with enough chlorine to keep them alive until they could be sent back. He just kept going." "But the men they left behind," exclaimed Beryl. "What happened to them?" Westervelt shrugged. "They never exactly found out." Beryl, horrified, turned to Simonetta, who stared reflectively at the wall. "For all we know," said the dark girl, "they were dead already." "It was about even," said Westervelt. "The Mazarians never heard exactly what happened to theirs either." There was a period of silence while they considered that angle. Simonetta finally said, "Why don't you tell her about the time they gave that spacer the hormone treatment for a disguise?" "Oh, you tell it," said Westervelt, trapped. "You know it better than I do." "That one," began Simonetta, "happened on a world where there's a colony from Terra that isn't much talked about. It's a sort of Amazon culture, and they don't allow men. They were set to execute this fellow who smuggled himself in for a lark. When the department started shipping him drugs that changed his appearance." Westervelt admired Beryl's wide-eyed intentness. "Finally," Simonetta continued, "his appearance changed so much that he could dress up and pass for a woman anywhere. He just walked out when the next scheduled spaceship landed, and was halfway back to Terra before they finished searching the woods for him. It made trouble, though." "What happened?" breathed Beryl. "They never quite succeeded in changing him back. His wife wound up divorcing him for infidelity when he gave birth to twins." Beryl straightened up abruptly. "Oh, you come on now." Westervelt reminded himself that the blush must have resulted less from the joke than from having been taken in. They were still laughing when a buzzer sounded at Beryl's desk phone. She flipped the switch, listened for a moment, then rose with a toss of her blonde head at Westervelt. "Mr. Parrish wants me to help him research in the dead files," she said. "I bet he won't try that kind of gag on me." "No," muttered Westervelt as she strode out. "He has some all his own." He looked up to find Simonetta watching him with a grin. She shook her head ruefully as Westervelt grew a flush to match Beryl's. "Willie, Willie," she said sadly, "you aren't letting that bottle blonde bother you. I didn't think you were that kind of boy." Westervelt grinned back at some cost. "Is there another kind?" he asked. "After all, Si, she's only been around a few weeks. It's the novelty. I'll get used to her." "Sure you will," said Simonetta. She returned to her letters, and Westervelt hunched over his desk to brood. He wondered what Parrish and Beryl were up to in the file room. He could think of no innocent reason to wander in on business of his own. Perhaps, he reflected, he did not really want to. He might overhear something he would regret. He passed some time without directing a single thought to the problems of the department. Then the door beyond Simonetta opened, and Smith strolled out. He carried a pad as if he too had been doodling. "Well, Willie," he said cheerfully, "what are we going to do about this Harris fellow?" "All I can think of, Mr. Smith, is to offer to trade them a few people we could do without," said Westervelt. Smith grinned. He seemed to be willing to make up a little list. "Some who never would be missed, eh? And let's head the page with people who take messages from thinking fish." He pottered about for a few moments before winding up seated on a corner of the unoccupied secretarial desk. "I was actually thinking of skin divers," he confided. "Then I realized that if it takes a 20-foot monster to wander the undersea wilds of Trident without being intimidated, maybe those waters wouldn't be too safe for a Terran swimmer." "Unless I could get one of the monsters for a guide," suggested Westervelt. The three of them pondered that possibility. "I can see it now," said Simonetta. "My name's Swishy. Me good guide. You want find pearl? Not allowed here. We no steal from other fish." They laughed, and Smith demanded to know how one thought in pigeon talk. They discussed the probability of fraud in the reports that Smith had received, and he concluded reluctantly that, whether or not some trick might be involved, there was bound to be some truth in the story. "I suppose we'll have to use this fishy network to locate him," sighed Smith at last. "It would take too long to ship out parts of a small sub to be assembled on Trident. The whole thing makes me wonder if I'll ever eat another seafood dinner." "Maybe somebody else will think of something," said Westervelt, partly to conceal the fact that he himself had come up with nothing. "Tell you what," said Smith, nodding. "Suppose you go along and see how Bob Leibman is making out, while I sign these letters. You might check at the comm room sometime, too, in case anything else on the case comes in." Westervelt agreed, made sure he had something in his pocket to ride upon should the need arise, and left. A few minutes later he reached the end of the corridor, having cocked an ear at the door of the old file office as he passed, and heard Beryl giggling at some remark by Parrish. He unclenched his teeth and knocked on Leidman's door. He waited a minute and tried again, but there was still no answer. He hesitated, wondering what would happen should he walk in and find that Leidman was physically present, but not in a mood to recognize anyone else's existence. Slowly, he walked back to the washroom on the opposite side of the hall. Washing his hands with deliberation, Westervelt decided that it might be best to get Leidman on the phone. He could not, in fact, understand why inside phone calls were not more popular in the office. He supposed that the face-to-face habit had grown up among the staff, probably reflecting Smith's preference for getting everyone personally involved in everything. There might even be a deeper cause. They were so often in contact with distant places by the tenuous beaming of interstellar signals that there must be a certain reassurance and a sense of security in having within physical reach the person to whom one was speaking. "I'll have to watch for that if I stay here long enough," Westervelt told himself. "You don't have to be a prizefighter to get punchy, I guess." He examined himself critically in the mirror over the sink, thinking that he could do with a neater appearance. A coin in the slot of a dispenser on the wall bought him a disposable paper comb, with which he smoothed down his dark hair. "I need a haircut almost as bad as Castor P," he thought. "I wonder if that really stands for Pollux. What a thing for parents to do. On the other hand, from people that came up with one like him, you'd expect almost anything." No one came in while he was in the washroom, much as he would have welcomed an excuse for conversation. He dawdled his way through the door into the corridor, not liking the thought of inflicting his presence upon Beryl and Parrish. That meant he would have to walk back as far as the spare conference room to find a phone. "Of course, there's the lab," he muttered. That was only a few steps away, and he could hardly do much damage between the door and the phone. Reaching the end of the corridor once more, he decided to make one last try at Leidman's door. Again there was no reply to his knock, so he turned away to the laboratory door and entered. He was faced by a vista of tables, workbenches with power tools, and diverse assemblies of testing apparatus, most of the latter dusty and presenting the appearance of Goldbergs, knocked together for temporary use, and then shoved aside until someone might need a part from one of them. By far the greater space, however, was occupied by shelves and crates and stacks of small cartons, or loosely wrapped packages in which various gadgets seemed to be stored, after plans of them had been transmitted to the field. Half a dozen large files for drawings and blueprints reached nearly to the ceiling. Racks of instruments in relatively recent use or consideration stood here and there among the tables and workbenches. To Westervelt's right, near the far wall behind which lay the communications room, he caught sight of a prowling figure. He recognized Leidman's broad shoulders and hesitated. The ex-spacer had paused to examine a gadget lying on one of the tables. From Westervelt's position, it appeared to be a wristwatch, or something similar. Leidman picked it up and turned toward a part of the wall where a thick steel plate had been fastened to an insulated partition of brick. He raised the watch to eye level, as if aiming. A thin pencil of white flame leaped from the instrument to spatter sparks against the already scarred and stained steel. Sucked up by the air conditioning, the small puff of smoke disappeared so quickly that Westervelt realized that the scorched odor was entirely in his imagination. Leibman replaced the instrument casually before strolling over to another table. He inspected an open pack of cigarettes with a grim smile, but let them lie there in plain sight. Westervelt reminded himself never to grub one of those, just on general principles. Leibman went on to a small cylinder, somewhat larger than an old-fashioned battery flashlight. Something clicked under his finger, and from one end of the cylinder emerged the folding blades of a portable fan. The X-Spacer pressed a second switch position to start them spinning. He turned the fan to blow across his face as if to check its cooling power, then held the thing at arm's length as he thumbed the switch to a third position. A low humming sound reached Westervelt. It rose rapidly in pitch until it passed beyond his hearing range. He shook his head slightly. For some reason, he found it difficult to concentrate. Perhaps Leibman's presence, unexpected as it was, had upset him, he thought. He decided that he must be getting a dizzy spell of some sort. Then he became concerned lest he turn nauseous. The final stage, hardly a minute after Leibman had last moved the switch, found Westervelt tensing as a wave of sheer panic swept over him. He stepped back toward the door, noticing dizzily that Leibman wore a strange expression too. Part of the youth's mind wondered if some of the ultrasonic effect were reflected from the walls to the X-Spacer. Another part insisted upon leaving the scene as hastily as possible. He got himself into the corridor again, actually panting as he eased the door closed behind him. He started to walk, finding his knees a trifle loose. Passing the washroom, he hesitated, but he decided that he could make it to the conference room. Once there, however, he slipped inside and sat down to recover. What does it take to have a mind like that? He whispered to himself. It's like a hobby to him. I think someday I ought to look for a job with reasonably normal people. A few minutes of peace and quiet refreshed him. He returned to the main office just as Smith was surrendering a stack of signed letters to Simonetta Diorio. They looked around as he entered. Well, Willie, did he have anything going? Asked Smith. He was kind of busy, said Westervelt. What did he seem to have in mind? Smith started to reach for Simonetta's phone switch. I didn't ask him. He was busy in the lab. Oh, said Smith. He peered at Westervelt's expression and added, Then perhaps we'd better not disturb him. It might spoil any ideas he's putting together. Westervelt managed a grunt of assent as he turned to walk back to his desk. Whatever he's putting together, he thought. I'd rather stay out of the way. He hunched over his desk, staring unseeingly at the notes he had scribbled earlier. He was vaguely conscious of the succession of talk in the background, but he did not notice Simonetta's approach until the girl stood beside him. What happened, Willie? She asked. You look as if he threw you out. No, not deliberately anyhow, said Westervelt. At least, I don't think he knew I was even there. Although how can you tell if he doesn't want to let on? He told her what had happened in the laboratory. She nodded thoughtfully. I suppose it has its uses, said Westervelt. I hate to think of the way he plays around with things in there. Wasn't there a time when someone killed himself in that lab? That was years ago, said Simonetta. She hugged herself as if feeling a sudden chill, her large soft eyes serious. Westervelt realized that she was actually a very beautiful girl, much more so than Beryl, and he wondered why he felt so differently about them. Simonetta seemed too nice to fit the ideas he got concerning Beryl. Something told him that his thinking was mixed up. I guess you just grow out of that, he reflected silently. Maybe they're the same under the skin. End of chapter 4.